When I was a student, when I started as a freshman student at Caltech in 1959, they had a tradition, and the tradition was that at the end of each quarter, just before finals, the morning of finals, all of the high fives in the student houses would play the Ride of the Valkyries at maximum volume. And this happened before each set of finals. And so today, when I hear that music, it's just fear, right? All of the reactions of fear set in. It wasn't fear of the exams, it was a fear of the faculty, of course, who were the guys behind the exams. And I didn't know any better because I was just a student. I never really knew any better the whole time I was there, but the people were very unusual. In physics, there was Feynman and Layton, and in chemistry, Roberts and Pauling, and biology, it was Beadle and Bonner and Sinchheimer. I never took a course from Professor Penner. He was a professor of aerospace engineering. But I know when I met him and just listened to him for a few minutes, yeah, there's another one of these guys. I'm glad I'm not taking his exams. They were different. And I've since known, as I've gone out in the world, spent my life, I've met other people like this, but they're different. They are more rigorous. Their minds are sharp. They're fine. They're wonderful people, but they think differently, and they are extremely rigorous and special in the way they approach their work. I don't know all of his qualifications, although I've been privileged to know him for 48 years, but I have indicative, perhaps, is that next month the United States National Academy of Engineering picks one of their members. It's the most prestigious engineering society. They pick one of their members to honor for his work in engineering research and education each year. And this year, Professor Penner is their choice. He's one of America's. But he's rigorous about this. I mentioned this and didn't get it quite right in the conversation, and so I have here a very perfect description of exactly what this award amounts to, plus an admonition not to mention it, but I didn't do that. Okay. So we're very privileged to have this extraordinarily outstanding engineer to speak with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. After this enormously informative and wonderfully amusing lecture that we just heard, I must say that the energy subject is unfortunately nowhere near as humorous as obesity, and so it's going to be, I think, pretty dry by comparison. Actually, I was invited to speak about coal today, and I don't want you to leave with the idea that I'm an enthusiast for coal. I'm an enthusiast for coal as an interim measure between where we are now and the nuclear millennium that I think a number of other people in this audience support also as a proper goal. Let me say that the nuclear paper that I gave here at this meeting a couple of years ago, it was called The Future of Nuclear Energy. That was not a good title because I kept getting letters from environmentalists. The paper is obviously worthless because there is no future for nuclear energy. And I want to explain, therefore, two facts. One is we renamed the paper. We renamed the paper because it doesn't really address the sensitivities of many people to nuclear energy. Now it is a paper in which we discuss the critical issues with nuclear energy. When I say now, I mean I finished this just before I came down here to talk about coal. Waste disposal. We don't have that in the title, but it's very much in the paper because that never was an issue, and it certainly isn't an issue now. We know exactly what to do, only we've never done it. And that's a mistake. That's a big planning mistake. Next, we hear about safety. There are all these people who are drunk on the job, and you entrust them with a nuclear reactor. So those are the reactors that have to be replaced. They have to be replaced by passively safe reactors, so that we depend on the laws of physics, on the laws of science to keep us safe in case something goes wrong. And finally, everybody knows that if you run a nuclear reactor, you're making material from which you can make bombs. Well, the next generation, well, a few years after the next generation, Generation 4 nuclear reactors are going to be passively safe, and they are going to be proliferation resistant, in the sense that the nuclear material will be used to the point where it'll be cheaper to get plutonium from natural uranium than from the leftovers of the nuclear reactor. So that was my preparation for a lecture on cold science. And that paper, by the way, is in press now, and it has an acknowledgement that there was a preliminary lecture given on that at a meeting of the DDP. The paper is quite different now, but it is at least emphasizing the crucial issues that the anti-nukes always bring up. And I would like to say, before I talk about the wonderful things that we can do with coal, that the nuclear reactors of the future, not Generation 3 plus, what we are going to build soon, but Generation 4, will not have any of the commonly identified flaws of nuclear reactors. There will be no waste disposal problem, which we know how to do anyway. They will be passively safe. Even if one of the operators is drunk, it won't cause a calamity. And finally, nobody is going to use the leftover material to make weapons that will disappear. One of the reasons for revising our paper intensively is that there was a study in Switzerland where about 100 people or so experts from the European community were convened in order to address a very modest subject, namely to keep the percentage of nuclear reactor output of electricity constant in the Swiss mix to the year 2040. And these are the people who, I think, evaluated all of the current generation and prospective future generations of nuclear reactors with care, and happily, inevitably of course, but happily they came out with the idea that the most promising reactor was the General Atomics reactor. And you may recall that one of my collaborators was from General Atomics. He liked that very much, and so we incorporated the Swiss study also into our paper. Where does coal come in? Well, you hear this all the time. We spend an enormous amount of money on imported oil, and it would be very nice if we could replace much of that imported oil with our own coal. We are told that we are the world's #1 coal-holding country. That's almost true, but we had to disassemble the Soviet Union into parts in order to make it come out that way. Then when you start on something like this, which as I say, I have done for very many years. I've been in and out of the coal business ever since I was an undergraduate and went down into a mine to see what it was like. It is the kind of stuff that I used to summarize colloquially by the statement, it's too hard to get up and it's impossible to use after you do. But that's not really true, because we can do a great many things with coal. And my last intimate involvement with coal was around the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. And I was very happy to hear repeatedly statements like, oh, the science was all worked out in the 80s and 90s, and so all we have to do is apply it. Well, that made me believe that I didn't have to read very much of what happened after we wrote our last report. Our last report, by the way, came out as a book. And the book has a provocative title, or a good title, I think. It's called Coal Gasification, direct applications of coal gas, which is a substitute for natural gas, and syntheses of chemicals and fuels. And that's really what I was asked to talk about. How do we make fuels out of coal? What will it cost? Well, I spent a great deal of time looking at the internet. That's so convenient that we always start there. We sometimes forget that what's on the internet is not necessarily the gospel. In fact, it may be totally wrong. I finally resigned myself to the fact that any numbers that I saw there would be illions, either with a B or the TR or an M in front of it, and that I really didn't need to worry about the difference because they are sort of used interchangeably on the internet all too often. But there's an enormous literature on the internet also on this subject of a new generation of coal, for coal use to tide us over between now and the period, and it's likely to be perhaps 30 years in the future when we can build safely this next generation of nuclear reactors. That's where I fit. That's what I want to do. That's what I think we should do as a country, not anything else. And that is very much consistent with the gospel as it comes out of Washington. But the gospel that's coming out of Washington lacks the financial muscle that's going to be required as of this date. It lacks that to make this transition from coal-based liquid fuels to nuclear-based substitution for our energy sources a reality. In fact, I'll show you some numbers later. They're wonderful numbers because they are so provocative. For example, EPRI has a program, very ambitious program. You read all that, you find that they're going to spend $1.2 million implementing it, and that's what's going to make a difference. But they have a very clever way of augmenting this because they have a formula for measuring the impact of EPRI dollars on the system, and that's a factor of 50. So, you know, for every $1 million, you get a little bang for your buck. Well, let me just say a few words of an introductory nature now. I'm not going to be discussing coal science in any depth. That's a very complicated topic. Those molecules, coal is really not coal. Coal is coals. There are many coals. They have all kinds of different structures. They range from the peat that is perhaps the precursor of the usable coal all the way to anthracite, which is practically pure carbon. These are all very different. They have very different values. They have to be used in a different manner. Those molecules are maybe not quite as complicated as the ones you learned about in the last lecture, but I've never really seen a description, quantitative description of a coal molecule. They're always described as sort of like the picture shown in figure such and such. So I don't think there's been anywhere near the money spent on coal structure that has been spent on the interesting health problems that you are all experts on now. When you look at the literature, in particular at the internet, you will find numbers. As I already said, don't believe them. The numbers are fuzzy at best. There's some numbers that we may know to 1 or 2 significant figures, or 3 if you stretch it, like the resource base. And when you look at the internet, you find numbers given to 5 or 6 significant figures. And when you see that, you know that you started with science and you ended up with science fiction in getting those numbers. And according to those numbers, I have to tell you this because this is one of the important things you want to hear. In millions of tons, our recoverable coal reserves are stated to be 250,000 million tons. Russia's are 157, China's 115, India 84,400, and at the bottom of the first 10 is Poland with 22,200. This ought to make you feel good, because we are really rich in that fossil fuel. Rich by comparison, according to very rough estimates. Good estimates of resources are made by the Us Geological Survey. And I'll show you an example of the kind of resource estimate that comes from there. It's completely incompatible with the kind of summary numbers that we have here. Somebody said that when you take these different types of coals and put them together, that's like taking apples, oranges, and bananas and ending up with fruit. And that's really roughly the analog that goes with these estimates. Everybody knows how coal was formed. It was formed in water-containing basins from primordial growth. And let me just say that so far I haven't seen even a Russian article that disputes that the coal is of plant origin. And so for the time being, I think we can accept that. It's here, obviously, and it has all kinds of direct relation to plants. And as far as we know, the abiogenic origin of coal has not even been proposed in Russia. So we may as well accept what our pundits tell us. Now with that, I would like to start looking at a few figures. Now this is a DOE, not news release, but propaganda. This goes back to the beginnings of, I think, last year. Vision 21, it's a government-industry cost-shared partnership to develop the design basis for integrated energy plants that will early in the 21st century result in the deployment of ultra-clean plants that can produce affordable electricity. We all like that. Transportation fuels, that's great, and other high-value products from feedstocks that include coal, of which we have quite a bit. At present use rates, we probably have enough for about 250 years. That's present use rates. Augmented use rates would reduce that time span. New discoveries will increase that time span. Those would both be part of the formula. Gas, well, natural gas we don't have much of at the present use rate. We'll be out of that about as fast as we'll be out of our oil, our liquid oil resources. Biomass, well, they have to put that in because that's modern propaganda, and that's going to be with us no matter what we say. And opportunity fuels, I don't know what those are. The biomass program, of course, was not invented by the present administration. I was deeply involved during the Carter years with what should be done in the energy area. And I can say with great assurance that I haven't seen a single idea that has been pushed in recent years that wasn't pushed during the Carter years. We had all these programs on how to use biomass and make alcohols and you name it. Hydroelectric growth, although our renewables, the usable renewables, are severely constrained by environmental rules. I think hydroelectric is a beautiful example because it's difficult even to get a permit to build a run-of-the-river hydroelectric plant because the side on which you want to put the plant is just the side that some special fish population doesn't want to be displaced from. So then you can't build the plant there. And if you go to the other side of the river, then you don't quite know what the fish will do. They may be inconvenienced also. So even a hydroelectric plant, of which we all think of as really benign, because we aren't doing anything except change the water flow a little bit and get some energy, some electricity out of it, are in a sense almost interdicted. The other renewables are also in very, very short supply. Geothermal energy is, we use everything we have, and so forth. So let us see what we can say about the big picture here. The big picture got a little truncated, I see. And the truncation doesn't really hurt very much. In 2005, our energy sources totaled in BTUs per year, which is a convenient unit. It can be easily converted to any number of other units, but it's a measure that will work. 2.5 times 10 to the 17th power. How much in 2005 of that was from renewable resources? 2.4%, the total. And of this 2.4%, most of it was hydroelectric and biomass, which includes wood, which is, of course, an old energy source. Most of our industry ran on wood during the 19th century. And then the new things like alcohols, which we are pushing, I think their principal effect so far on the energy supply has been negligible, but they have driven up the cost of corn. And as a result of that, some animal feeds are going to be more expensive, which means meat will be more expensive. And as a result of that, we may decide, as we did near the end of the Carter years, that growing our oil or getting it from plants is maybe not the best long-range program. In this competition between energy and food, energy will always be second. The food supply will always have to have first priority. Well, let me comment on this last idea a little bit because it's not quite complete on the chart there. The 2.4% total renewables, hydroelectric is roughly 40% of that. Biomass, particularly wood and waste, are about 50% of that. The net result is that of the renewables that are in the modern mix, that are being advertised as saving our society, wind energy is less than 3% of renewables. And wind energy didn't begin during the last 5 or 10 years. It was heavily subsidized during the Carter years and thereafter. The direct solar use is less than 1% of renewables. The renewables are only 2.4% of the total, and less than 1% of that is very, very little. So we have made almost no progress at all in converting to renewable energy, and not in the last 5 years, but I'd say in the last 30 years or the last 35 years, even though this has been heavily subsidized. That's something worth remembering. I just want to emphasize that when you make resource estimates, you must be careful to distinguish between reserves and resources. Reserves is what you know you have and what you can use now. Resources is what you think you may get with better technology at the end. These are completely different numbers. They have a completely different meaning. And if I look in particular, this is not legible to you, but it's okay. I can't see it either, so it won't hurt. When you look at this carefully, you will see an estimate for the collection of fossil fuels used at the present use rate, supplying about 1,000 years of total needed energy. And I'm talking now about reserves. We have identified this much of reserve energy for this collection of fossil fuels, shale oil. This used to be big business in the 1970s. I think the big oil companies spent billions of dollars building some of these plants. They looked like landscapes on the moon when you went there, which made it all the more impressive. But they gave up on it at the end because it was not competitive with the kinds of oil prices that the producers in the Middle East and elsewhere who have natural oil resources could afford to sell their resources at. That's one of the main problems we have. This is an economic and a political problem. If we develop a costly new resource, and I can't, I spent an enormous amount of time trying to get a number to this. I don't know what a barrel of oil from coal is really going to cost. When we did our last big study, the number was $35 to $45. This was around 1990. And that was judged to be too high in competition with foreign oil, because that stuff comes bubbling out through a pipe. It only cost 60 cents originally to collect it. Now, you can't invest multi-billion dollars in a totally unstable industry unless there is some guaranteed support, long range, from the government. And when these crises go away, our programs go away, and then periodically, as from Carter to today, we rejuvenate them and try to do a better job. But the hard economic facts don't really change. I need some light again for a minute, because I want to refer to something that is not on the charts, because I found these numbers too late. Our natural gas supplies, as I said, are about as huge as our supplies of conventional oil. And at present use rates, our natural gas, unless we replenish it with coal, which we can do easily, we've done that for a long time, will be gone in 50 years or less. That is, the peak productivity there is behind us. But there is another resource that we know about, which we don't know how to recover yet. And those are clathrates. This is caged methane at high pressure, deep down. And we do have a resource estimate that's not very old. It was done just a few months ago, I believe. We have 320,000 trillion. That's a TR, that's 10 to the 12th power. That's a big number. Trillion cubic feet of gas hydrates, but only 1,200 million cubic feet of conventional natural gas. If we could start recovering that would make an enormous dent in our long-range supplies. What it would do, it is give us 12,800 years at current use rate instead of 40 years at current use rate. So there is again a resource that we've talked about forever that we should consider as a potential addition to our supplies. And when this will become a reality is hard to say. I think only a moderate amount of money has been spent on recovering these clathrates, these caged hydrocarbons, these caged natural gas, or methane actually, in crystals at depth. It looks great for the future, but we don't know how to do it yet. And those are the numbers I just gave you. Now, I do have to show you some coal resources, because since I'm supposed to talk about coal, I have to give you numbers, and I have already said that these should be taken with a large grain of salt, because they were given here to 6 significant figures, and if you believe the first 3, you're an optimist. But what is nice about these is that we have the big United States number, almost, not quite double, but 70% or 80% greater than our nearest competitor. But if you go down the side, you will see there's Kazakhstan and the Ukraine, and when you add all those up together with Belarus, we started out at about the same level. One of the great outcomes of the Cold War is that we are now #1 in the coal business. Now, there is a new technology. This technology was actually discussed extensively in this book which we prepared in about, this was published about right around 1990, a couple of years before that. It was published by Elsevier. It's a great book. It was written by an enormously large number of people. The panel itself, of which I was the chair, had 11 members. Now that's already a trick. You get 11 busy people together for meetings every few months, somewhere where there's a big coal program going on. That's a feat. But in addition to that, we had 14 senior executives from the fossil fuel industry going over everything we did. And then after the report was put together, we had experts who were not official members, but very much in the coal industry, reviewing what we had written. And the reviews came out just the way you'd expect them. The people we had referred to and whose work we had lauded, they loved the report. And the people to whom we had referred without saying anything, they said the report was okay. And the people whose work we didn't refer to said it was a terrible report. So it came out normally. Well, among the new technologies that was heavily talked about, and actually a major experiment was done in California at Coolwater, is integrated gasification combined cycle. And because you're going to hear that word all the time, I don't want to bother you with too much technology. I do want to describe this. Oh, there's our panel. And as you can see, it was a big panel. There were 11 members, and they were mostly from industry, although a good few academics were involved. Some of the minor schools like MIT and Berkeley were represented as members here. This is what I had begun to talk about, the integrated gasification combined cycle technique for using coal-derived gas.
Really too far away from this.
Like this?
Yeah, you can hold it if you want.
Okay, fine. Integrated gasification combined cycle. This was the new buzzword that we had. And here's this beautiful laser, red laser that we can point with. This is a schematic drawing showing a generic IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycle, to get higher efficiency out of what we end up with, the gas we end up with, if we start with a coal feed. The coal feed, this is all schematic. There are very complicated hardware systems between each step. So coal and water go into the first step, and out comes steam. And from the coal feed, we get coal syngas, SNG, as we call it. So this is a synthesis gas from coal, which has to be cleaned because it's got all kinds of bad things in it, like too much sulfur, which we have to remove. And then we use this hot gas at the top end of a combustion turbine. So we burn this gas and generate rotation and power. This generates electricity. This is one cycle. It is the cycle involving the coal converted to syngas being burned and giving us electricity. This is now on top of another cycle. The bottom part, what comes out of this turbine system, is hot exhaust gas, which goes into a heat exchanger where we make steam by putting feed water in. And also we get some steam from the original gasifier. And so we have steam coming in two ways. This steam goes through a turbine and generates power. And then we have exhaust steam. And this power plus this power is what we get from the integrated gasification combined cycle system. And this is what you'll read about as the important new technology that is being developed, improved, and that has efficiencies ultimately for converting the coal energy that it comes in originally to electricity at a level, I think, typically in the high 40s, with a goal as high as 52%, 53% electricity. Even in the late 80s, there were a good many plants of this type, where we start out with coal and generate electricity. Remember that coal is responsible for 40% of the electricity that we generate in the United States. And or even worldwide, it's a number of that order. So it is the prime source, a prime source for electricity generation. At Coolwater in California, we had two 1,000 ton per day plants. This was a plant built by Texaco. Shale Oil had a small plant in Texas, 250 tons per day. Dow Chemical had a big plant, a 2,500 ton per day gasification system, and so forth. So this type of system is really quite old. It dates back to the 80s and 90s. And now if you look at 2000 up to 2010, you will see that there are very many plants of this type being built all over the globe. This is not yet making liquids for transportation. This is the way we use coal to generate electricity. Of course, the electricity generation has to continue while we wait for the nuclear millennium. In the nuclear millennium, we can do everything with electricity. We can certainly make hydrogen with electricity by high temperature electrolysis, quite efficient. We have hot systems in these modern nuclear plants so that we can make all kinds of gaseous products and liquid products from the gaseous products. I will be talking about these conversions briefly in a moment. These are some of the operating plants in the 90s, and the new program looks very much like this, except there are many, many more entries all over the globe doing integrated gasification combined cycle systems. What is so great about the IGCCs? They have higher conversion efficiencies, typically 10% higher than if we just burn coal in an old-fashioned system. I won't bother you with what the heat rates are and what the efficiencies are. They are here given in the high 30s, close to 40. We expect to go to perhaps the low 50s. So that will be quite an improvement. They have lower pollutant emissions than their antecedent systems. There is a 15% reduction in cost. They are more rapid and cheaper to build than the smaller antecedent units. Well, this is a very complicated system that I don't think I'll discuss. It's coal to syngas according to the Exxon donor process. I have it mostly in here in order to indicate to you that all the big oil companies are very much involved in this, because if there is a new substitute oil industry being developed, they don't want to be left out. But they haven't been particularly left in either, because they really haven't done an awful lot in making from natural gas or from coal and syngas the fossil fuel substitutes that we're looking for when we go to the pump to fill up our cars. Well, there is another interesting type of system that I really don't have time to discuss, which is a slagging lurgy. I'll skip that discussion. Well, if you now look at the internet, you'll find all kinds of tidbits that are informative in the way. For example, liquefaction of coal, a patent. In Japan, the Japanese have been very active in this field, and they have proposed to give their technology license for free to India, Indonesia, China, for use in making oil substitutes. This is being done, as I say, all over the globe, but on a very small scale, not really big commercial plants. The costs, as I said, I tried very hard to get numbers, but I don't have any numbers. I know that there are subsidies given, I think it's 51 cents per gallon or something like that, proposed by the US Congress, with the idea that these will be raised when the price of oil in the market is above $40 some years downstream, which suggests that they are in the same cost range that we were around 1990. And I don't know how realistic that is. I think the price will not go down below $40 a barrel unless a miracle happens of some kind. Now, I said that coal is not coal, it coals, and I want to say a few words about that. This is a standard chart that is used to describe coals. And here is a list of all the coals. We begin over here with, this is percent carbon in the material. And this number here is around 40, 50%. And the ordinary coals that we have most of, not peat, that's not even on this chart, but the next higher one, lignite and subbituminous coal, and then the bituminous coals. These have carbon concentrations beginning around 45%, running up to about 80%, above which we are getting into anthracite and subanthracite coals. Each one of these has different heat of combustion, different value as a fuel. They occur in different parts of the reserves from which we recover it, and they are very complicated to describe because they are, in fact, very complex organic structures. Here is an artist's version of what a coal structure looks like. Each one of these little hexagons is a benzene-type nucleus. They are fused all over the place. They have carbon on the corners and hydrogens attached to them, of course. They have all kinds of impurities attached, minerals of every conceivable type. And I think this would be almost like the DNA unraveling to put really quantitative data like this together for a particular mine. And since there are so many mines and so many different types of coals, the chemists who do this would be happily occupied until the millennium. But I think the value of this is limited because we do fairly simple things with the coals. We convert them. And when you saw this coal resource base before, let me show you what a real resource assessment looks like. This is from the Us Geological Survey. It's an example of what they do, only an example. I can't do it after all. I was brash there before. If you look at these, you find numbers, and these numbers that are given here are an indication of the value of the... Yeah, I'll put it on top. That's too logical to be... These numbers are... well, the bottom number is a thickness of more than 42 inches. The next number is a thickness of 28 to 42 inches. The next number, 14 to 28 inches. The top layer is called thin. the middle layer, intermediate thickness. The bottom layer is called thick. And the one on the left, this one, is actually measured. And this one here is indicated by what exploration was done. And this one here, the big one, is inferred. This gives you some idea of how tenuous these resource estimates really are. Very complicated business on the resource type. I have said nothing about recovery of coal. If it's on the surface and strip mined, it's a big mess, but it's easy to do. And if it's underground, which is what we are talking about here, because these are at various depths, I should have said that. The one on the left is less than 1,000 feet from the top. The second one in the middle there is the indicated one is also less than 1,000 feet of overburden. But when you go to the middle one horizontally, then it's overburden of 1,000 to 2,000 feet. And ultimately, the tiny little one has an overburden of 2,000 to 3,000 feet. And how much of all this is really accurate? Well, it was done by the Us Geological Survey, an extremely competent organization. And these numbers are quite good. They're not good to 5 or 6 significant figures that we like to put on, but they are certainly acceptable numbers at any location. And that's one of the problems, that the resource base is reasonably well in hand, but not as well in hand as perhaps it should be if we are going to start basing our entire fuel technology system on this resource. The next curve over here shows an interesting fact, if I had it up there, and that is that the number of miners dropped precipitously after about 1940. That is, mining has become very much more efficient. This is a general process scheme that is a little bit difficult to describe. I think I would like to go now to the summary chart of what we can do. This is a summary diagram put together first at the Coal Research Laboratory in Pittsburgh, and then put together again and updated. And in a nutshell, what it says is, here is the coal, and what can I do with the coal? Well, I can do everything with the coal. I can make anything I want with the coal, depending on what the catalysts are. I can make gas, I can make oil, I can make special chemicals. I can build an entire chemical industry around this coal nucleus. And some of the things that are particularly interesting to note are that I can make diesel fuel, I can make a whole variety of chemicals. There are trace elements in the coal which allow me to get trace elements if I want them. I can make ethylene, I can make glycol, I can make, well, I start with a periodic table, and so I have a lot of options of what I can make. Some of these trace elements, of course, are very toxic, and they have to be removed before we can burn them. And that is a part of the upgrading of the coal and of the conversion of the coal to something useful. Well, here are these wonderful data from EPRI that I should have mentioned. I'll give you the quantitative numbers now. They're going to spend $9.5 million and then multiply that by 53 in order to get the effectiveness of their $9.3 million. I think that somebody ought to check up on that number, because it may not be quite that big. It might not be a bad idea to increase the $9.3 million for the principal research organization of the electric power system in the United States. We really need to put much, much more money into this area if we are really serious about the conversion or replacement of imported oil by oil derived from coal. When and how this will be done is not clear. I think that there's a 10-year program from the US Department of Energy that has a $2 billion budget, but if you divide that by 10, it's only $200 million per year, and that isn't even enough to build a single plant. So the funding is totally incompatible with the goals, and I don't know how that will change. I mentioned coal mining briefly. There's a problem with coal mining. If you've ever been in a coal mine, you'll have an idea of what an unpleasant occupation that basically is. And it's also an insecure occupation, because even today, after many, many improvements in the mine, we still have periodic large accidents killing many people, dozens or even hundreds of people all over the globe. I mean, this is not a particular technology that we are expert in. We've got company everywhere where coal mining goes on. And so we had a program in the late 80s at Livermore to learn how to recover the coal and make syngas out of it without bringing it to the surface. This would be underground mining. These programs were terminated in the early 90s, and that's very unfortunate, because I think that sooner or later we should be working on this kind of new technology that keeps the miners out of the mine and gives us probably a larger access than we normally have to the resources underground. Well, let's talk now about coal liquefaction. Or let me first talk again about coal gasification. After we have the gas, there are well-known technologies for converting the gas to liquids. First, there is the Fischer-Tropsch, or first there's the Bergius process, which was developed in Germany around 1923. And that's a good process. I won't describe it in detail because that would take more than my entire time. And then there was the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis developed for making liquids out of the gaseous constituents in the late 20s. And the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis has been used and is being used worldwide to this day. A variant of the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis was developed in South Africa during the apartheid years when they didn't have any liquid fuels. The Germans used Fischer-Tropsch synthesis extensively during World War II. That is how they got their liquid fuel supplies. But of course, we don't have any dollar numbers on what the real costs of that stuff were. In a war environment, the costs become more or less irrelevant. You do it because you have to. The South African technology, Sasol, was similar to the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. The basic idea is the same. They built plants, many plants, in many countries. We had several Sasol plants in the Gulf region during the 80s. But the production was too expensive to compete with imported oil. So that technology was not further developed. It is in use now, not only in South Africa, but in many parts of the world. I don't want to give you the idea that there is no liquid fuel being made from coal-derived syngas. It is being made. We know how to do it, but I don't know the real costs. We had $35 to $45 in 1990, and the US Congress seems to be gearing up to the idea that that's where the original cost is going to be. But by the time you market it and you get it at the pump, I'm sure it'll be a great deal more than that. I don't quite know how much it'll be. So this underground in situ recovery, which was also our main technology for getting shale oil, was really terminated around the end of the last century. The big companies were all involved in this. I would be hard-pressed to say why coal liquefaction is preferable to shale oil recovery, the type of programs that we had in the Piceance Basin in Colorado. Many of the big companies, Exxon for one, were very active in this program. Chevron, you name them. They were all there, and they were doing it on a substantial scale. If you went into one of these processing underground plants, it was a little bit like being on the moon, because you had these fantastic structures, columns that had been broken up and into which you fed air streams in order to recover the oils remotely. There were people underground, of course, with these shale oil recoveries. I think that's a question that ought to be asked, really. Is it more sensible to go back to oil recovery from coal, or coal conversion into oil, than it is to go back to the big shale recovery plants? Shale oil recovery, and particularly recovery from tar sands, has been commercial in Alberta, in Canada, for many years. The US companies were involved in that too, going way back to, I think the early 70s and even before that. And that's a very successful program. There is considerable land impact with these systems. I remember going to northern Canada, to Fort McMurray, to look at one of these shale oil recovery systems, and I saw a realization of my image of what it would be like to walk on the moon. There were many little lakes around the plant. These lakes held some of the disposed water, which was very toxic, and the lakes were lined with little cannons. So when the overhead birds made their migration, they could be scared away and told not to land in one of these lakes because they were extremely toxic. So there's a problem with all of these recovery schemes that we talk about. There is an awful lot of oil around, but other than the conventional oil that just bubbles up at you and the heavy oil sources, it's very hard to get to, very costly, and very hazardous. So no in situ recovery of coal syngas is in progress, as far as I know, in the US or anywhere else. Okay, could we have the lights on again, please? I have one chart that somehow got a little bit... I do want to mention one thing. Considering carbon dioxide and the mess that it has made in our lives, I'm going to read you a little paragraph now from a 1987 book, which was written by very knowledgeable people from the University of Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Energy Technology Center, and from the Mobil Research Laboratory. Mobil is the M in XOM, as you know, because Exxon bought Mobil. That's the biggest oil company, bought the second biggest oil company, and made the biggest bigger. That's about it. But let me read this to you because you'll find it amusing. It is something about the virtue of carbon dioxide. It's a little bit on the long side. All of these and liquid fuels can be made from syngas, and it is therefore possible to envision a petroleumless, that means without petroleum, refinery. As tetraethyl lead disappears from automobile gasoline tanks, the demand will grow for oxygenated chemicals with high octane ratings. An economical synthesis of such fuel blending agents or additives is needed. An economical synthesis of ethanol from syngas would help solve this problem. Of course, we know how to make ethanol from syngas. That's easy. Sulfur and nitrogen compounds are removed from crude and can be sold as solid sulfur or as ammonia. Gasification process is how it comes. Produce CO2 in considerable amounts. Now, if you read the literature, you find out that using coal in any form is going to add to the carbon dioxide burden of the environment. Now, I'd like you to hear what experts had to say on that topic. It is considerably easier to isolate carbon dioxide from gasification processes than from flue gas, because it's concentrated, obviously. Efforts should be made to remove carbon dioxide in a fairly pure state from gasification processes to satisfy the growing demand for this chemical. Original plans for the Northern Great Plains coal to methane plant included a pipeline to transport carbon dioxide to oil fields. And why? For enhanced oil recovery, for which it is ideal. This would have produced revenues, well, for this particular pipeline at that time in the range of $20 million. Other uses for carbon dioxide are in syntheses of urea, supercritical extraction, refrigeration, carbonation of beverages. I'm sure that many of you drink Coca-Cola, although it's probably not good for you. But anyway, that stuff has carbon dioxide in it that very often is generated originally from coal or coal substitutes. So don't think of carbon dioxide in concentrated form as a pollutant. That's utterly absurd. It is a valuable chemical, and it has especially great value when it is applied to the recovery of oil. Tertiary recovery. You know, when we get oil out of the ground, we start out with primary recovery. We just put a pipe down there, and out comes the oil. And secondary recovery, we might put hot water or steam in there. And after all that is done, most of the oil is still underground. And then to get at the tertiary recovery, the third step in getting more oil from a well, you might inject this concentrated carbon dioxide and leave it down there, because all it's doing is displacing the oil and increasing the yield substantially. And I don't have simple numbers on how this goes. But in any way, it's been used, found very effective, and is obviously great stuff for oil recovery. I think I must be somewhere near the end of my lecture.